In this video we're going to be taking a look at the vampire counts, one of the 4 playable factions for Total War Warhammer. Vampire counts are, not surprisingly, all about vampires. Vampires are what you'd expect. They are extremely powerful undead beings, and using magic and the force of their will they can raise the dead and force them to fight for them. At the core of every vampire count army there will be a vampire, and the original badass vampire was Vlad von Karstein. He might make an appearance, I'm not really sure, but he's a beast of a character in every single way, and he can bring his beloved Isabella. Then we have Count Manfred von Karstein. He's slightly more magical oriented than his brother. You also have human character called Heinrich Kammler. And Manfred comes in different varieties, but that's a bit outside of the scope of this short video. Krell, Lord of the Undead, is a white king. He can do a number on enemy characters. Very strong and very cool looking. You have Konrad von Karstein, Isabella von Karstein, and these vampires, since they enslave the undead to their will, it means that most units in the vampire army, they're going to crumble, they're going to disintegrate if the vampire dies. And it's going to be very interesting to see if that's a mechanic they choose to bring into the game, because it's very integral to how the vampire counts work. Since they don't really suffer from morale as such, and they cause fear, one of the only ways to remove vampires from vampire counts from the battlefield will be to destroy their characters, making the army crumble, or to beat down the undead and make them lose through combat resolution. However, the dead can be raised again and again and again. So although you're killing zombies, you might find that necromancers are raising more zombies to fight you all around. Now we'll talk a bit more about heroes later on. Now for the Walking Dead and their impact on the old world. The points I've marked red here are points of interest. The reason why the vampire counts are included, I think, is because they are sort of within the empire here. Castle Drakenhof, the Haunted Hills, Sylvania, lands of the vampire counts. Bloodkeep is also highlighted because this is where the Order of the Blood Dragons arose, when Vampire defeated every single member of the Knightly Order and they fell into vampirehood. Bloodkeep was raised, but the legend lives on. Now, the mainstay, the freshly risen dead of the vampire counts are zombies, and they are just terrible, pathetic in combat, very cheap, can overwhelm the enemy in terms of numbers, and this is what I'm talking about when I mean there needs to be different unit sizes, because zombies in the same unit size as any other unit, they're going to be close to worthless. However, imagine if you're able to raise zombies from the enemy troops and add that to the unit of your own men. Let's say that the zombies don't have an upper limit in the amount of men they can have, and a necromancer or a vampire can continue to raise zombies. Now we have a very, very interesting mechanic on our hands. Slightly more powerful than the zombies, still weak troops. Skeletons, they have been dead for longer than zombies. They don't have any flesh remaining on them, so they are harder to kill. Now the cool thing is that both skeletons and zombies can be raised. So zombies are easier to raise, skeletons slightly harder. Then we have the beasts that follow the armies of the vampire counts. So we have crypt ghouls. They are necrophages, they eat the dead. You can see they're carrying skulls and bones around. They are slightly better in combat than your zombies and your skeletons, but they have poisoned attacks, but they are more difficult units to raise. They can be killed quite easily, and although they are a cool unit and they bring some interesting things to the table, like being able to deploy further ahead of the army, I quite like my zombies and skeletons. Then we have the dire wolves, and dire wolves are undead hounds. Can move very, very fast, but the problem with these units, they'll crumble super quickly if essentially you have a leadership value, and the leadership value doesn't work the same way as the leadership value for, say, a human detachment of troops. The unit detachment will test for leadership if it's in a situation where it might turn tail and run. However, the undead use their leadership value to determine how many models they lose due to crumbling, losing combat, general dying, and so on. So when you run around with a very low, when you roll 2 dice and check that for leadership, let's say that you have a leadership value of 2, and then you have to check for crumbling, and you get unlucky and you roll a 12, that means that 10 models just disappear off the field. So they can die very, very quickly to crumbling. Then we have the flyers in terms of the fell bats and the bat swarms. And here's one of the strengths of the vampire counts. One being numbers, the ability to raise additional troops, and the other being they have a plethora of flyers. So many flyers. They are second to none in terms of flyers in the game, at least in terms of cheap flyers and the sheer diversity of flyers they can bring. So you have the bigger fell bats, can be useful for sniping war machine crews and such, and then you have the bat swarms, fairly useless in combat, but it would be really cool to see huge bat swarms holding down a griffin for a short amount of time. Then we get to the ethereals, and now things are starting to get more dangerous with the undead. You have your standard spirit host here, ethereal creatures. They are a swarm. They are pretty cost effective in that they can tie down things like monsters fairly effectively, but they crumble if they lose a combat, and they will lose many combats due to combat resolution. Just a short mention of combat resolution. Combat resolution determines the outcome of an engagement. So wounds inflicted counts towards combat resolution, the number of men in a unit, the number of ranks, a musician, not a musician, a standard bearer, any kinds of war banners the unit might be carrying, where it's attacked, is it attacked in the flank, in the rear, all of these things come into play. So fighting up against the full strength regiment with the full complement of war banners and the several ranks, a single unit that crumbles like these swarms are going to have a huge problem, causing enough casualties to not just lose automatically due to combat resolution, and that means they will crumble. But against monsters and such, things get interesting. They can potentially hold them down for a long time. And there are other ethereal units. You have the Grave Guards, you have the Black Knights. They are sort of skeleton white, so they have more of a memory of who they used to be before they were enslaved to the will of a vampire. So zombies are mindless, skeletons are mindless. Whites have sort of a vague memory. They have better martial skill, much more dangerous units to face on the battlefield. And you also have some peculiar units. The Cairn Wraith. Not entirely sure. Cairn Wraith? Not entirely sure how that's pronounced. Which is a very dangerous single type of monster. You can bring several per unit. Then we have the let's see, the Hex Wraiths. They look kind of silly, but they come with special weapons, scythes with some weird wraith flames going on, and they can move very quickly. They are fast cavalry, which means they are super fast, but quite fragile. But they can move through enemy units. Since they are ethereal, they can move through enemy and friendly units as long as they don't end up being close to that unit. So if we have the ability for these guys to sort of phase in and out of existence and move through units, that could be pretty damn cool. And this section I've simply called Death, because there are some really dangerous units here. We have the Vargeists, able to fly and do a lot of damage very, very quickly to any vulnerable troops like war machines or potentially skirmishers if they're not able to fire at them. And also mages, single mages. We have the Vargulf. He has some small wings so he can't fly, but an absolute terror in close combat. We also have the Blood Knights. These are vampires, so they are not susceptible to crumbling because they are vampiric. And the same thing goes for the let's see here. The same thing goes for any unit that has the vampiric trait. It won't crumble because it has a will of its own. It's not entirely enslaved to the will of a vampire. Then we have the Black Coach, which is a black coach. It's a chariot ridden by a wraith, carrying wraith he is, and it's a fairly dangerous unit. It can also fly if given the appropriate upgrades. Then you have the Terrorgeist, which is also a dangerous unit, but it's fairly flimsy. It's a bit vulnerable to the same things many of the other undead units are vulnerable to: massed ranks of troops, shooting, flames, fire, such. Then we have the Mortis Engine, which is fairly hard to bring down with 5 wounds. It's sort of a supporting chariot. It's not meant to charge into huge blobs of infantry, but it has some very interesting. It has a very interesting special ability. For example, you can give it a Blasphemous Tome, which is going to let all wizards within 12 of the Mortis Engine have an significantly increased chance to cast spells from the lore of vampires. And if there's a miscast, so in Magic you can have miscasts, which means that something bad happened, then both friend and foe will have to roll on the miscast table, and the opponent chooses the result. So your opponent is going to choose the worst possible result. I don't see that being brought into Total War Warhammer, but anyway, interesting stuff. And I won't be able to talk about all of the undead units, but there are so many. But they have so many flyers that I think it would only be appropriate that the vampires, the vampire counts, would be the Lords of the Night and the Lords of the Sky. For heroes, we also have a bunch of options. We have your standard human necromancers that follow a vampire lord. You have your vampire lords, you have vampire characters. You have vampires riding an abysmal terror, which is a funky looking creature. You have the White King, you have a Banshee, you have a Strigoi vampire, sort of a beastly vampire character. The Zombie Dragon. Zombie Dragons, not as strong as their living counterparts, but it will be interesting to see how these units are able to fare against the other flyers of the game. And Magic, I'll make a separate video about Magic because it's a fairly big topic. But of course, Magic is essential to the vampire counts. And the vampire counts can bring huge masses of skeletons and zombies that they potentially can raise more of during the battle, which could be an awesome mechanic. Also strong supporting characters, but the undead army is a fragile one, and even though they have a huge amount of flyers, those flyers are also going to be very vulnerable to missiles and magic. Empire handgunners and dwarven thunderers, units like that, are going to have a field day plucking these units down from the sky, I'm sure. But I really want to see the sky darkened with bats and the ground covered in shambling zombies. So I am very much looking forward to playing with the vampire accounts, and I hope, no pun intended, that the Creative Assembly really flashes out the vampire accounts and makes them what they should be, which is a huge mass of shambling corpses, the terrible, terrible monsters from your worst nightmares, all bound to the will of a mighty vampire lord that, if slain, will see the army start to crumble all around him. Strength and honor.